welcome to Rising Leader Stories from the Legacy of Young Athena. This is going to be episode 3. This is our new podcast series. We have a very special guest today that we are interviewing. As many of you know who've gone through Young Athena with me, Domestic Violence Awareness Month is something that I hold near and dear to my heart because I am also a survivor of domestic violence. And it's a very kind of topic that gets overlooked a lot, I think, especially in women, in leadership, in just all the things we experience as women and mothers. So I'm absolutely happy to have you here today to share your story with us and how Young Athena impacted you and your future with your babies. So to just introduce the topic of this, I just want to say that this conversation could definitely be a trigger warning. So any of you who have experienced domestic violence or anything like that, I just want to say that this could be triggering to have this conversation. Both of us are very comfortable in our stories, but that doesn't mean that everyone is. So I just wanted to bring it up that we are going to talk through some not necessarily graphic content today, but we are going to be truthful about the stories and what our experiences were. So welcome to the call. I'm so excited to have you. So will you just take a moment to introduce yourself and kind of talk about a little about when you went through Young Athena? Just like, when was that? Was it a couple years ago now? A year ago.
Nope, it was last year.
Last year.
It
Oh
was
yeah. Okay.
spring,
Yeah.
so
Okay.
not even a full year ago.
Yeah. So introduce yourself and tell us a little about you.
Of course. My name is Adriana Bernal. I am a single mother, divorced single mother of 2 little kiddos. My oldest is 4, he's going to be 5 in December, and my youngest is actually turning 2 in October. Um, I went through Young Athena's program at GCU spring of 2024. And it was during my last semester at GCU right before I graduated. So we got to do the graduation ceremony about probably like 2 to 3 weeks before actual graduation, which was very monumental to me. Because it was a moment where I could share with a wonderful cohort of women um, just how impactful Young Athena's was. Um, and in a moment in my life where everything that I was pushing for, everything that I had struggled through in the past, is all like, I guess I could see my goal coming to fruition. I was like, I'm graduating. Like, I'm no longer struggling. I'm like at the end. I did it, and it was one of those moments where it's like, I did what I set out to do. I overcame everything that had like stood in my way. And I've shown not just myself, but my kids that you can do what you set your mind to. So it was a really amazing, amazing experience for me to be able to go through Young Athena's and get a little more in touch with who I am as a person.
I love that so much. I love it. And just for all of our listeners' sake, that's, I think, the beauty of the program is we allow, right? There's a lot of allowing. Like, you don't have criterion, there's no grade. We just allow you to show up in all that you are and however you're feeling and whatever that looks like, and we will hold that space for you. Because that's what we're here for, right? It's really impactful, I think, when women experience the support of other authentic women just wanting to show up for you and to be there for you and to be in community and kind of hold that space for you. So I love that you like fell into us and now I get to keep you forever. You know how that goes,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So, as we were talking about, so you are a domestic violence survivor, as am I. So thank you for your willingness to be here. So if you wouldn't mind, I would just like for you to share some of your story with us and kind of how that experience unfolded and kind of what took you to the other side of it.
Yeah. Um, so I met my husband, ex-husband, um, at GCU actually. It was my second year. And it was kind of one of those whirlwind, I can speak English, moments where, he became my best friend. We did a lot of everything together. We went to small groups, we hung out with the same friends. Like it just became natural for him to just kind of, you know, become part of my life. Um, it was one of those, things where like he hid a lot of himself because he was so preoccupied with what others thought of him. That he did an incredibly good job at hiding a lot of things, not just from me, but from his parents as well. Um, and so a lot of the typical red flags that one would see, like like more like arrogance and making sure that, he came first, like a lot of those were hidden. At the very beginning of our relationship, it was all about, what he could do for me, how he could be there to support me. And he did all of that. And when, um, he had a way, like a charismatic way, which is something that's also very typical, of these relationships, is that they're very charismatic. And so he had a way of being able to push me outside of my boundaries and manipulate me into doing things that I wasn't sure I was ready for or wanted to. And one of those was being intimate. And I ended up being getting pregnant before we got married. Um, and so obviously that, coming from a Christian background and both being at a Christian university, it became like a really big stressor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we worked through a lot of things. We ended up moving in together with my parents, and then I, gave birth to our son. And it was during that moment, the first, before my son was born, he was really, really good at um, trying to put me before himself and doing a lot of things and making sure, especially since we were living with my parents, that people, the opinion that they had of him was that he was a good person, that he was doing what he was supposed to do to take care, that he was the man and he was going to be a good husband and a good father. Um, Within a week of the birth of our son, he started competing with our son, an infant, a newborn baby. He started competing with him for my attention. And it became one of those, moments where like if our son would wake up from his nap and would need to nurse, and we were having a conversation, he would get upset when I would get up to go pick up our son to feed him, and he would be like, "Well, clearly you don't love me as much as I love you, and you love our son more than you love me because you can't even, hold a conversation and maintain eye contact, because to him, not maintaining eye contact was like a sign of the utmost disrespect. And so often he would say, well, just go hand him to your mom while we finish this conversation. And obviously, like in those moments, my first thing would be, first thing I would say was like, I can continue having a conversation with you while I'm feeding our son. Like it's not impeding me. And also, what the heck is my mom supposed to do to feed our newborn son? Like my mom isn't breastfeeding. Like no, she did that
Right.
years ago.
Yeah.
Like it's not her job. Like she is the grandmother. I'm the
Mm-hmm.
mother, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And little by little, like he would start to, use that against me. It'd be like, well, you love our son more, so you pay more attention to him. You don't care about me. You don't love me. And as soon as he like, latched on to that idea, whenever things would go wrong, he would blame me and would, start to use offensive language. He would curse at me. It started um, more verbal and emotional than anything else before it really turned physical. Um, and, you know, for me, like I just wasn't sure how to get out of it, because one of the biggest things that he would do is that he would use the Bible against me, and he would use my beliefs against me,
Mm,
because one of the major things that it says in the Bible is, when you get married, like, let let no one, you know, leave what God has brought together. And it was one of those things where he'd be like, "Well, you can't leave me because, what is everybody else going to think about you? What are the rest of the Christians going to think about you? Like,
mm,
how does this
yeah,
stand with your faith?" And it was also very internal for me, where like I have a very big belief, and I'm a firm believer that people can change. There is redemption, and people can become better if they so choose to.
yeah,
But that's the thing, is that it's up to them, and it's not something that I can do. And like for me, because I was, wavering on what, like, if I could wait for him to change, for him to decide and realize, that if he kept going like doing what he was doing, he was going to lose us.
yeah,
Which was what ultimately he would say that he didn't want, like that we were his purpose in life. And obviously that would contradict his actions. Like if something is your purpose in life and is something that you hold so dear and you want to protect, well, why are you the first person that's harming?
right.
And so it was
Fair
very
question.
contradictory.
Yeah,
And he would be on his best behavior when my parents or his parents or out in public. And then at home, when no one could see him, it was like the mask would come off and he would turn into, an ugly version of the person who I had fallen in love with. And so being able to face the truth and face that was really hard for me,
yeah,
because ultimately, like, he was also the father of my children.
right.
And like that was like one of the biggest things, is like he's not just like, if it was just me, like I think, and like obviously like it's a very big if, is that like if it had just been me, it would have been a little easier. Not that it was easy, but maybe sooner I could have left, because it would have been just me. But he was also and is the father of my children. And like, that is a relationship that I can never take away and no one can take away. It is He is their father.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, so let's
and
pause. Can I pause you for
yeah,
just a second?
of
Because I
course.
want to kind of touch on the mom guilt piece of this too.
Hmm.
Just because I've personally experienced it, right? Like my last relationship was where my youngest was born, and it was very much rooted in this too, where it was out in public, everything's good. I found myself like kind of not telling the truth about what the experience was like at home. When my older kids weren't here, there was like behaviors that would come out. And then
Hmm.
as we got more and more comfortable in the relationship, the behaviors did start coming out in front of the kids, and it was like inappropriate. But I think there's like we get torn when we have these big open hearts, right? Of like, I do believe in change. I also believe in redemption, right? I also believe in forgiveness, and my core value is heart, right? So like, if anybody's gonna know that I can forgive and I can over love, right? That was my idea. I'm like, I'm just gonna over
Hmm.
love him into wanting to be a part of us, right? Um,
Right.
but then there's like this weird thing that happens where when your kids start witnessing and you start realizing like almost how you shift as a woman just in your existence with your kids,
Hmm.
that it's like this overwhelming guilt that happens of like where like now I'm really stuck because my mom guilt is one, I don't want to take the father of my children away, but then two, I don't want to raise my kids in this environment. And so then we get stuck in the like crossfire in our mind of all
Yeah.
of that with this heart of forgiveness. And it literally becomes this trifecta, right? So tell me a little bit about that. Like, what was your emotional experience and all of that as well? Was that similar for you? Were you feeling kind of like, I can't let go, but I can't stay, but I like, how was that
Oh,
experience for you?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, so when our son was really little, he would treat me a certain way, but he would be, sweet and loving to our son. And like he, never. in the beginning never did anything that could potentially harm our son. And so that weighed really heavy on me because I was like, I want to forgive. Like I'm willing to forgive what you've done to me because I, as an adult, as a mother, I can endure everything and anything that comes my way for the sake of my children, and he was, being a provider and he was taking care of his son and he was doing, the right things that, in the beginning. And so for me, it was, that was what was tearing me apart was like he wasn't being a good, partner to me, but he was being a good father to our son in the beginning. And so it was one of those like, well, what right do I have to take, like, like break this family apart and take our son away from his father when he's not doing anything to harm his son?
Mm-hmm.
And like I like didn't realize how detrimental that actually was, like how much our son was witnessing and what he was soaking in at the beginning because I was a first time mom. And not to say that moms who aren't first time moms don't, but I'd never, I was new to everything, new to being a wife, new to being in honestly a full-time, like permanent relationship, and I was new to being a mom. I was 21 years old. Like it was like a brand new world for me. And um I couldn't separate that. Like I didn't realize how damaging it actually was to our son, even though our son was a newborn, even though he was a year and a half, when I kicked his father out. Like I didn't realize how much my son had actually soaked up until my son was 2 and we went to go visit him. We were still married, but we went to go visit him and his dad tried to hug me, and I was pregnant with his sister at the time. And when his dad tried to hug me, um, my son like stood up and swatted his father's hand away. He like straight up just went like, no. And his father was like, excuse you, like that is rude. You do not hit me. And instead of apologizing, he turned to his dad and he was like, my mom doesn't like it when you touch her. Do not touch my mom.
Powerful.
And he was 2. Like it
Right.
was one of those moments where I was just like, oh my God, like how much did my son actually, you know, soak in? Like,
Mm-hmm.
um, because like he was about like a year and a half ish,
Mm-hmm.
when, when I kicked his father out. So obviously those interactions that were violent had lessened.
Mm-hmm.
Like, those were obviously very traumatizing. And it is very true when, negative experiences are the things that you commit to your long-term memory much faster and that they stick with you so and are very impactful and are very strong emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And in that same interaction, after his father left, my son came and sat next to me and put his hands on my face. And he said, "You're okay now, Mom. You're safe. Dad's gone." And I was like, I don't, as a 2-year-old, he doesn't actually know how, impactful that moment was for me.
Mm-hmm.
But in that moment, I was pregnant with his sister. My son was 2, and he was being my knight in shining armor against someone who's, you know, 3 times his size.
Right.
And in that moment was when I made that decision. I was just like, it's gotten to the point where my son feels the need, that instinctual need to protect his mother from his father. I cannot stay here and I cannot subject my children because if my son remembers all of this, and he was very, very young when I kicked his father out, I'm not going to subject his sister to that either.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was when I made the decision that I needed to get out. I needed to find an out. I needed to divorce him. And knowing that he was very prideful and arrogant, that I needed to make it his idea for us to divorce, for him to let me go in a way that wouldn't be, you know, a nasty divorce battle and custody battle. I needed it to be his idea. And it took probably an entire year for me to actually like almost up until yeah, like a year after basically for me to finally succeed in getting my divorce, you know, and it was one of those moments where I realized that that mom guilt, you know, of not wanting to take something away from my son, that relationship that is very important. A father-son relationship is very important. I realized that my mom guilt in not wanting to deprive him of that was actually depriving him of a healthy upbringing.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized that it was, you know, sometimes that mom guilt, you think that you're doing the best for your children, but you're not. And it was like that moment when I realized I was like, wow, like instead of actually helping my son by staying in this relationship, I was actually, you know, damaging him, even though I wasn't the one that was physically doing anything to hurt him or to
Mm-hmm.
traumatize him. By staying in it, I was allowing it and allowing
Yeah.
him to be, you know, exposed to that. And that's like when it really, really hit me that you know, I let the me feelings of how I felt, of what I felt like I should be doing, dictate what was correct and not correct. And, you know, it was very impactful to realize that sometimes the mom guilt lies to you. You know, that mom
Yes.
guilt doesn't have the full perspective. It's just
Yeah.
it's very tunnel vision sometimes. And it was one of those moments where I was just like, wow, like I don't have to be, you know, in a conventional relationship or like even do things the way most people do them in order to do what's right for my children.
Wow. So powerful. And you're so right. And then I think there's like a level of where we start to check into like, where does my responsibility lie as a mother, right? Because then we click
Hmm.
into responsibility. Like, my responsibility is to provide a healthy, happy, nourished environment for my kids, right? And then when you start to
Yeah,
realize that
absolutely.
what you're choosing is opposition of that, it almost makes it really clear. But I think we're so caught in the mess that it's almost like, how am I even going to get out of this? Right.
Oh yeah.
Because it's like they're everything in the beginning and like serve you in every way. And it's so fulfilling and the love is so beautiful and it's passionate. And it's like, it's almost like your dream relationship in the beginning.
Hmm.
Right. And then
It's
all
the
of a
honeymoon
sudden,
phase.
yeah. And then it like completely implodes. And then you're like, wait, where is that? But now I'm attached to that, right? My mental image of
Hmm.
what this relationship should be lives in what it was. And then reality sets in, and we're like still sitting in hope of like, I maybe can go back. But yeah, you're
Right.
right. There was a time where that outward emotional outburst started turning towards my kids as like kind of a little slandering their dad. And that's when I was like, their dads, right? Because my oldest three
Hmm.
are not his. And so only my youngest is. And when the moment that that happened is when I was snapped out of my situation as well, where I was like, oh, I'm grown. You want to talk mess to me and say the nasty things to me, like I can process that. I have a completely developed frontal cortex. I can rationalize what your human experience is. Even though I know it's not right, I can carry that. I thought I could anyway, right? We really can't,
Yeah.
because at the end you got to like peel all that off slow and steady, right?
Oh
But
yeah.
I think that's what we get. We're like, oh, I'm grown, I got this. Like, I've been in enough arguments, like I can navigate this, it's not a big deal. And then when you see like all of a sudden your kids are like receiving that information, just like you're saying. So for your son, it was the experience. Like he already knew how you felt about it, right? And then as
Hmm.
soon as I saw like that outburst go outwards towards them, I was like, oh, now I'm going to step into responsibility. My responsibility is to make sure my kids are happy and healthy and safe. And right now, that's not where we are, right?
Yeah,
So how did
absolutely.
you navigate kind of the end of that? So I know you told me that you like kicked him out, and then you were living with your parents. I would assume you and your
Hmm.
babies are now living with your parents. Was there an attempt on his end to like rekindle things with you? Kind of how did that ending all like kind of come to fruition? I know you said it took like a year, but
Yeah,
like emotionally for you, how long did it take to unpack, and are you still unpacking some of that?
yeah. So when like he would, before I had decided and like really like, put my foot down and, you know, made the decision, the conscious decision that I was going to find a way to divorce him one way or another. He would always threaten that he would leave me or that he would, you know, leave me and take our children with him. Like that was his thing. Like he would do whatever it took to take the children away from me. And so ultimately that, became like also another like chain, like a shackle that, he attached to me was that the fear that like, he would somehow be able to manipulate and charm, other people into thinking that he was what was best and right for our kids. Um, and he's, at one point, we had been going to, therapy or counseling, marriage counseling together. And he would say and do all the right things, with the counselors, but he would never implement it into his life, into our life together. And even, like, probably about 6 months after we started going to therapy, to counseling, um, he stopped showing up. He would, go to work, live in his apartment and go to work and then just stay there. And he would like stop coming by to see his son. And when I would ask him, I'm like, well, your son wants to see you. Like, where are you? And and his apartment was like 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes away from our house.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like, and his workplace was 10 minutes away. So it wasn't like we were asking him to go, 45 minutes, an hour away. And he would be like, "Oh, well, I'm tired." I'm like, "Okay." I'm like, "So you're telling me that now your son isn't even worth that 15-minute drive to come visit, and you still, say that he's the most important thing in your life," kind of thing. And so like it was moments like interactions like that that really helped me, like continue to open my eyes to that. Um, and the way that I was like I'm still unpacking it. I'm still unpacking a lot of things because it's only been this May 2024 was a year
Okay.
since the divorce papers were signed. So it hasn't really been that long.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm still unpacking a lot of what happened because I've realized that my interactions, for example, with my father or my brother, I know, like I know in my heart and I know logically that they would never do anything to hurt me. But because they share similar physical attributes, they are men. Like sometimes when they catch me off guard and they try to hug me, like I have this innate feeling to like, don't touch me, get away, like run for the hills kind of thing. And
Yeah.
I'm like, I was never like that before. Like my love language was touch. I used to hug everybody. Like, like hello, I'm gonna hug you. You know, um, and with my friends and with obviously like my family. And now anytime a male member of my family tries to hug me, I have to like rationalize and internally be like, he's a man, but he's not my ex-husband. So if he hugs me, it'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
Like a hug does not equal suffering from them.
Right.
And like I still have to like, you know, do that, like work with that. And living with my parents, sometimes obviously, people get mad, emotions are all over the place. And sometimes when my dad, gets mad, like, and, he has a very deep and resounding voice and it carries. And like when he gets mad, like the last time he got really mad over, I don't even know at this point, like I ended up having an anxiety. Like I ended up having to like leave the conversation like without like and being like disrespectful to him in how I handled it because I couldn't handle it, you know?
Yeah.
That was the thing, is like I couldn't. I wasn't, mentally prepared to handle it or emotionally prepared. And I came and like I hid in my room. I was like in a corner, balled up. And then like when my dad came in and he realized, he's just like, "Oh crap, like this is not what she normally does. This is not true to her. Like what is going on?" And so he realized that something was going on. And eventually like, he calmed down and I calmed down. And he came, and when he like, he wanted to have a conversation, he was like, "Can I, like you, can I, come into your personal space?" And he apologized. And it was one of those moments where, like I realized that even though I have, done the work, gone through therapy, gone through counseling, like it's not something that's one and done. Like I
Right.
went through a year of counseling, and this panic attack was um, beginning of May, and it was one of those where it was just like, it's something that you have to work at every day. And sometimes it's little things. Sometimes it's big things that cause a trigger. And sometimes like you think that you're over it because you haven't had, those adverse effects for a long time. It was an entire year where I was fine. And then I realized, oh shoot, I'm not. There's still
Yeah.
some things I gotta work through. Like there's still some lingering things. Um,
Yeah. I think that's a valid point too for a lot of us because what we don't I don't think we comprehend when we're in the middle of it how much our subconscious remembers, right? Like even
mhm,
your cellular body, right? As a trauma informed yoga teacher, we talk about trauma like a lot of times we call them activations, right? Because even the word trigger is triggering for some people, right? So when that
right.
activation comes, it's so physical. It's not even like you're not even in control of it. It's truly how your body responds, how your sympathetic nervous system all of a sudden takes over and all you can do is flee. Like words, no, there's like nothing there. And it's like all you want to do. And then like the
Absolutely.
shakes start and like you're like you feel like you could throw up at any point and it's literally so physical. And I had to like teach myself to count backwards and like right there's all these things that I've learned through emotional intelligence to like help work through that fight or flight, but it's so physical that sometimes even doing that stuff takes so long to bring you back because you get so deep into that activation that it's like where does this end, and all I can do is breathe right now, and like sometimes it's sobbing and sometimes it's hyperventilating, and like it's so physical and it's so overwhelming too because you don't it's like it's almost like you feel like you don't have control of your body anymore. Right? Like
Oh
you're
yeah.
like here I am, but like where's my body, because this is like not how I exist, right? Like that's I love that you brought
Oh
that
yeah.
forward because I think that most people think of an activation, they think of like, oh, I like might get upset and cry, like right, or I might be sensitive to criticism, or I might be, there's like they always I feel like it gets placated a little, like it's like,
Hmm.
oh, you're just gonna have a little bit of anxiety, and you're like, no, I was balled up in the corner, like can't
Hmm.
breathe, probably crying, and like literally can't do anything with my entire body because all my body wants to do is crawl in a hole, right?
Oh
And
yeah,
then yeah,
fetal
go ahead.
position because,
Exactly.
it's a comfortable, it's a calming position
Yeah.
because you feel safe in that fetal position.
Right.
And like I was like, sobbing my eyes out, and my dad came in and he was just like, "What? Yeah, okay, this is
Yeah.
not healthy. This is not good." So he knew to walk away because I remember, I couldn't even remember how I got to my room, let alone on the floor in a corner, hiding from the world. I remember my daughter walked in, and like it's one of those moments when you realize how emotionally linked your children are to you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because and how much they actually like perceive. Because I was like, fetal position, curled up, crying, and my daughter, who's normally very like vocal about what she wants, and she was hungry in that moment. So she was like, "I need a nurse. Come nurse me."
Mm-hmm.
instead of doing what she normally does, which is, be very vocal, she's just like sat next to me, laid her head like on my shoulder until like I calmed down, until like my heart rate became even and my
Mm-hmm.
breathing evened out. And then she was just like, okay, and she like grabbed me and she was just like, come sit. I'm
Yeah.
hungry. And it was one of those, moments where I was like, okay, my daughter isn't even two. She was probably a year and a half when this happened.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like still conscious enough and receptive enough of my emotions being all over the place. And she was just like, I'm gonna sit and wait until she's got her crap together. And then we can
Right.
go, feed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's amazing to know that, you know, these little people have that. And it's not just amazing, but then that's, what also opens your mind to realize that because even at a young age, they're so perceptive
Mm-hmm.
of, who their caretaker may be like and their emotions and how they are, it directly influences how they treat, the other people who are causing that reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Because, for the longest time, when I would, when I first had kicked out, my ex-husband, I was a little more sensitive, you know, and I would cry a lot anytime my parents would like raise their voices and were like arguing. And like they didn't even have to be arguing with me. I could just hear it and I would start to like bawl and shake. And my son would like get really mad and he would like go up to his grandparents and be like, "Why are you making my mother cry?" Even though
Oh,
they weren't actually, doing
yeah.
anything to me. And so
Mm-hmm.
it'd be like one of those where then, they realize that, you know, I was at a very sensitive point in my life. And, it's their, on the other side is like their dad's side of the family. Like they look very similar, like facial expression wise, like how they talk and how they walk. Like their, I guess, auras are very, very similar. And so my children, for the longest time, were super uncomfortable interacting with the other side of their family. And they would be scared constantly. Like anytime their other grandmother or grandfather would try to pick them up, they would cry. They would cry and scream. They're like, "Nuh-uh, we're not having this."
Mm-hmm.
And so it would take my children like upwards of an hour to feel comfortable enough to play and like walk more than 2 feet away from me.
Wow.
Like now they're like so much better because we've had more positive and good interactions, and their interactions with their father are minimal to none. They see him for like an hour, 2 hours, tops 3 hours every 3 months.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
That's very limited, short interactions, and obviously those interactions are supervised.
Mm-hmm.
And so now like my children like they love going to their other side of the family because they're like, oh, like this is a good experience and I feel
Yeah.
comfortable enough doing it. But I realized that because I was so uncomfortable going over to their house because of how much they reminded me of their father,
Mm-hmm.
my children were also picking that up and like taking note of that.
Yeah. I love that.
And
I love that you say that you brought this up too, because I was laying in bed with Steven one night and like, I don't know if you know, but I actually divorced my ex-husband in 2020, and then I dated him for like almost 2 years after. So like we were separated for almost a whole year, and then I went back to him. And at one point, when I was finally done, I was laying in bed and I was like crying. And I was like trying to hold it together, like my son always wants to sleep with me. Like ever since everything hit the fan, like I'm his safe space. And so he lays in bed with me and he just looks up and he goes, "Mom." And I go, "What's going on, buddy?" And he goes, I'm so sad right now. And I was like, oh, buddy, I'm so sorry. Do you want to talk about what you're feeling? And he goes, I just feel like I lost something really important. And I just like sat there for a minute and I was like, oh, baby, that's not yours. That's mommy's. Mommy's feeling like she lost something really important, but mommy needed to lose that really thing that feels really important right now. I was like, so do you need me to hold you? And he was like, no, I think I'm okay. I'm just going to lay here next to you. And I was like, okay. So I just like kind of started rubbing his back. But that was, I think, a moment for me where I was like, like he's literally, they
Mhm.
filter everything we feel, right? And as a mom, especially, I feel like if you're close with your babies at all, that's going to be the reality is they're just going to filter your whole
Oh
experience
yeah.
and they're like relying on you to make those calls, right? And then you're like, oh yeah, like you're picking up on my energy and I should probably be truthful about what my experience is so that you're aware that you don't have to carry the burden, right?
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, like just recently, so they do, my son's at preschool and they do, they paint their family portraits. So like you send them home with a picture and they paint a portrait, the frame. And, obviously like they had just finished this project. And so I knew it was very like fresh. And it was one of those moments where like I saw everybody coming in with their portraits and like their family pictures. And my son is the only one without a father in his picture because I don't have any pictures of his father, and because I want to instill in him that just because we don't look like the complete normal family, that doesn't mean we aren't complete. Like, we aren't actually missing anything. We are
Right.
as complete as they come. And like, I realized that I was feeling very sad and disappointed in like what what my son's future would look like without, a stable, present father figure. And, my son asked me, he was like, Mom, he was like, where's dad? And I was like, what do you mean? Like, he doesn't live with us. Like, you know, why are you asking? He was just like, well, because grandma said he went on vacation. Is he never coming back? And I was like, no, no, he didn't go on vacation. They sent him to work, but he's been back. I'm like, he's been back for a bit. And he was like, well, then why doesn't he come visit me?
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, oh, and like, I just, didn't know what to say. And he was just like, well, is it because of work? And I was just like, like your dad does work a lot. He works every single day. Um, and I was just like, and, I'm like, and he doesn't come visit. And he was just like, well, it makes me feel sad. And I was like, okay. I'm like, do you want to talk about it? And he said, no, I don't want to talk about it, but I just want to let you know it makes me feel sad. And I was like, okay. I was like, well, it makes me feel sad that you're sad.
Yeah.
And like, that's kind of when I realized I'm like, you know, I need to focus on, exactly that. Like, I'm trying to promote, the idea that we are a complete family and he's not missing anything. And here I am, being sad about the fact that my son doesn't, like his family picture doesn't look anything like the rest of his, schoolmates. And I'm like, okay, I need to change that perspective because me, like, sitting here feeling sorry and sad is not actually being helpful or healthy in any way, shape, or form for him.
Mm-hmm.
And, like
Yeah.
they pick that up a lot.
Yeah, you're so right. When I was fresh out of my divorce, I was like doing my best to hold it all together, right? Because I went from, so I was a single mom of three when I met him, and then we had Steven. So at this point, I'm a single mom of four, right?
Hmm.
And where was I going with this? So sorry, I got a little like I got a little in my activation over you sharing that with me because I was like, oh, I lived this too, right? But oh, I was telling you. So right after my divorce, I like took me and all my kids in counseling, right? And I was like on with my counselor, and she goes, so when's the last time you cried in front of your kids? And I was like, oh, I haven't. Like I've been crying myself to sleep, or I cry in the shower, or it was like very orchestrated because I wanted my kids to see strength, and I wanted my kids to see
Mhm.
poise, and I wanted my kids to see like almost, I was almost like I was operationalizing what we were going through. I was like, it's okay. We got this. I'll check these boxes. We'll handle it. I did my entire divorce pro per, where like I just had an attorney review my documents. Like I did it all. I built my entire case myself. And so I was like operationalizing it. And so I'm in counseling, and she was like, you do realize that your kids are grieving this as well. And your ability to grieve with them gives them permission. So you not falling apart in front of them is not honoring their emotional space as well, because they don't feel like they can fall apart. And I was like, oh, oh my goodness, right? Like I didn't even realize I was
Yeah.
forcing them with these tiny little bodies and probably these super big emotions to like navigate, like operationalize their own grief. And so after that, I was like, oh, I have to do this differently, because I don't want them to feel like I can't hold space for their big emotions, right? And so I think like the next week I was having a really rough day, and I just stood at the countertop and like put my head down, and I just started bawling. And they just all came over like without anything and just held me. And that we just all like cried together. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences I ever had. And I was like, oh, this is what that like group therapy needed to feel like the whole time. And then ever since then, now my kids feel very comfortable talking about that experience we went through, right? And they'll even be like,
Mhm.
Mom, I was just telling my friend about like some of the stuff we went through. And I'm like, girl, like I know, like it's a lot. And they still like, but now I feel like they feel safe in the expression of it. And so I think sometimes too, as moms, we're like so busy out here being strong, right? Like we're like,
Mhm.
we can do this, like we can navigate the hard things and we can move forward. And then it's like, yeah, but our kids need a little bit of softness too, because they need a soft place to
Yeah.
fall, right? And so I think we have
We
to
forget
figure out what that
sometimes that that vulnerability is very important to their growth and development.
100%, 100%. Yeah. So speaking of vulnerability, I really would love to talk about your GCU project that like kind of brought this domestic violence conversation all to the surface a lot, and like really kind of made you be a little vulnerable in a very public way. So if you'll tell me about that, I would love to just hear a little bit about how that all came to fruition.
Yeah. So, fall semester before I did Young Athena's, I did one of the honors classes. It's academic journal writing, and it's, reflective practice. And the whole idea, you gotta write something. And, the only person that was going to be seeing this was like my teacher, and it was, someone that I like trusted and do trust, and someone I'm very comfortable with. And so I wrote my article about my experience, about my struggle of being a single mom in higher education, and like, what that looked like in my case, of the obstacles of, I'm a DACA, I'm a survivor of domestic violence, I'm a single mom, and I'm a Christian, and being in a Christian university, like what that looked like to me, and why, like my first time through. I, had always gotten A's. Like I was a straight A student. I had that like 4.0 GPA, like on top of everything. And then, being in that, relationship, in that toxic domestic violence relationship, like I went from being a straight A student to being a straight F student. And like, when I was the way that I saw it is like I was failing at being a mom, failing at being a wife, and I was failing at being a student, which is something I'd always been amazing at. So if I was failing at being a student, which was something I was like I never had to think about, then how good of a mom was I? Like was I being a good mom? And so obviously, being in that cycle of like it was just a toxic cycle that I was also doing to myself
Mm-hmm.
and bringing myself down. And and I realized, I was like when I was writing this reflective practice, because the whole point of it is you reflect on a problem, you find out, uh, you dissect the causes and the obstacles of said problem, and then at the end, like the conclusion is that reflection of like what did you learn? Like you have to come into this practice with an open mind in order to learn, like through this problem. Like, what is it that you actually learned? Did you learn anything at all? And when I wrote it, I found it very cathartic because,
Mm.
one of the main parts of like, I guess the meat and potatoes of the project itself, of the reflective practice, is the story itself. Like, I had to write down, you know, my story of how I met my ex-husband, how I realized, what was going on, the fact that we had two children, um, and one was conceived out of wedlock. He was born 3 months after we got married, but he was conceived out of wedlock. And then I had, our daughter, and then I was, struggling with my faith. Like it was a crisis of not in terms of like me believing in God, but me believing if like what I was doing was right. Like,
Yeah.
where was I able to see him in my life? Like I
Mm-hmm.
knew that he was there, I just couldn't see it. And then being in, obviously like a DACA, like struggling with, the current administration and trying to do away with the program. And so I was looking at like, well, if I lose DACA, then I lose my status and like I can be deported. I can lose a lot of things. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was one of those where like I had to learn to go through all of that. And when I was writing it, I was like, wow. I was like, I didn't even realize that the reason that I kept, you know, beating myself down, like I sincerely thought that the reason that I was failing at being a student and failed to get my degree was because I didn't know how to be a mom, that I was like sucking at being a mom. So when I did the
Wow.
practice, like the reflective practice, I was in a way, unfortunately, but also relieved to find out that the reason what had affected me the most was my relationship with, the father of my children. It was a welcome relief to know that I wasn't a bad mom.
Mm.
Like
You're
I had
right.
lied to myself about that,
Mm-hmm.
but then it was like an unfortunate realization that I wasn't as over, what had happened as I thought I was.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did Young Athenas. And when I entered Young Athenas, and it was, the principles, and the main principle that like hit me really hard was living authentically. I was like, because honestly, like even though we don't do living authentically first, um, in order to do the rest of them and to really like succeed in doing the rest of the principles, you have to live authentically. You have to be true to yourself. You got to show your soul to be
Mm-hmm.
able to really, truly act courageously, constantly learn, build relationships, collaborate. Because if you're not true to yourself, you're not actually showing anything genuine to the
Mm-hmm.
people that you're trying to build those relationships or collaborate. And when we hit that topic was like around the same time that the honors showcase was going on. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna, do a poster presentation. I'm going to submit it and see what happens because I have to accept that that is part of my story.
Mm-hmm.
It is my story. It's not all of who I am, but it's a big part of who I am right now, because it
Right.
was so recent. That's
Mm-hmm.
not to say that, 20 years down the line, like that's no longer going to be a big part of who I am because I've done so much more, you know. But right
Right.
now, it is a really big part of
Yeah.
how I see the world and how I approach things. And so the living authentically principle, like that just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was like, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna put myself out there. I'm gonna be authentic and I'm gonna show the world who I am. Because if I can show random strangers who I am, people who represent this Christian worldview, this Christian sphere, okay? I I can do that to my children. I can be a true and authentic person for my family in my personal life because I'm a firm believer that integrity is not what you show the rest of the world. It's what you do in private, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you can be like an a person full of integrity and do those things without, doing it for the sake of others, for the opinion of others, then you're being true and authentic to yourself and to the rest of the world.
Right.
And so when I did when I did the project, I was so nervous because my ex-father-in-law is someone who's in the administration of GCU.
Oh,
So I knew that if I did this presentation, he was going to see it. His colleagues were going to see it. His bosses and his boss's bosses were going to see it.
right.
Obviously, the way that the information is presented, it's very removed, and I would never dream of naming names and pointing fingers because my experience is, mine. It
Mm-hmm.
should not, be detrimental to anything that he has. Um, but I knew that he was going to see it, and I knew that other people who knew, who would be able to put things together would know. And I was like, okay, this is my moment. This is my chance to not chicken out and be authentic and truly implement those Athena principles and just go for it. And like originally, I had submitted it with the purpose of it being an honors showcase, and I didn't get accepted. But in that moment, like I was like, when I didn't get the email, I was like, okay, I'm gonna send an email to Dr. Nagley and be like, okay, I know my presentation didn't get accepted, so can you give me feedback on why it didn't and what I can do to make it better?
Right.
And then she sent it to Catalina. And
Okay.
then Catalina was like, okay, it's not going to be in the honor showcase, but it can be in the general showcase, like the conference, undergrad research conference. So just do this, this, and this, and you'll present it. And I was like, okay, solid. So I had like two chances to whip it, like, like whip out. And I
Mm-hmm.
like pushed myself. And I realized that before Athena, I never would have done it. Like, I never would have like thought that I was capable, strong enough to do that and present it. And, come the day of, I was nervous, jittery, but I was excited, and I ended up talking to a lot of women and like a lot of other, faculty members about my research. And like one of them, like there's a small snippet in like the I want to say like the GCU journal, like one
Mm-hmm.
of the reporters or like the writers, journalists was going around, and she did a small little section on my presentation. And like I was like, I never in a million years would have dreamed that I was comfortable enough so recently, having been divorced and gone through all this, being able to do this. And then I was like, I'm able to be proud of that and proud of myself. And like now that I do it, like now that I did that, like I realized that I can throw myself and put myself in any path forward and be proud and know that like I can do it as long as I stay true to myself and my core values and not
Right.
let anything taint them.
Right. Ugh, I love this so much because you know me and live authentically, and like my story with that too. I'm a
Hmm.
recovering people pleaser, and so live authentically was really hard for me too. And now I just feel like Young Athena, in teaching all of the women that I've taught over the past six, we're in our sixth cohort right now. It's like when you start to realize that that is the key to happiness, success, love, like a great human experience. It's so powerful, right? It's so powerful.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that you were just inspired and that Athena like made you feel safe enough to like be you, right? That's truly the environment that we aspire to create for everyone is like you're here with everything that you are and you're completely safe and you're held, and like Young Athena time is the time to be messy or to be clean or just to like let it all out and whatever you need, and here we are, right? It's so, there's so much therapy that comes, and obviously not clinical therapy, right? But there is, when you're in a community of women who are all there to just be your hype girls and like love you and love on you and
Oh
in a
yeah.
safe space. I just feel like it's there's nothing like it. I know. I always tell Ashley, I'm like, we're gonna change the world. We're gonna change the world one woman at a time. Because I think when you leave Young Athena too, I feel like we value women differently. Right? Like I can
Hmm.
tell you I value women so differently than I valued women before. And there's like no one in the world who wants you to succeed more than me. I'm not going to be in competition with you. I'm going to be the one in the corner when you're like, yo, I need 10 minutes because I'm feeling down. And I'm like, yeah, girl, what do you need? Right. But I wasn't like that before. I was so like inauthentic and it made me root in comparison. Right. And so when you root in comparison, just like you're saying, your story is, well, like, what are the Christians going to think of me? And now, like, I'm pregnant as a student at GCU, right? And like, I'm pregnant out of wedlock. And it's like, there's a lot of like that luggage that we carry around instead of just being like, yeah, I am, and like I'm not going to undo it, so here we are, right? There's
All
so
right.
much power in just accepting your whole story. So I love that that was also your experience. So with that, like talk to me about how like embracing your authenticity and how has that like changed how you relate to others now? Like are you feeling like you're like you show up in relationships differently than you did before?
Yes, like I realized that I was hiding a lot of things, not from my mother, but from my father. And my father has been, will always be the way that he is. But he has always been my primary supporter. Like my mom is always there, and she's my mom. But there's a difference when you get that support from a dad. Like there is
Mm-hmm.
that, it's that daughter-father relationship that I felt like was crumbling because I was constantly hiding things and I was constantly avoiding. It was that avoidance of like, I don't want to show him how broken I am because he taught me to be stronger than, you know, anything. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't want him to realize how much how broken I am and how much I
Mm-hmm.
need to work on myself to get, you know, back to where I was before and even further.
Mm-hmm.
And then we ended up doing like this mindset leadership conference together. And in that moment, I was just like, wow. I was like, I've been authentic in every other relationship except that relationship. Like my brother knows. Like with my brother, like, that's one of the things, like he was the first person I talked to when I realized that my relationship was not a healthy relationship. And like,
Mm-hmm.
I like obviously like offhandedly asked him, I was like, so if you were ever mad, would you ever like physically hurt your wife? And he was like, huh? You know, he was like,
Right.
okay, where is this going? Like, no, I would never. Like, why are you asking me this? Like, what's going on? And like my brother called me out on my bull. So it was like like with my brother, it's been one of those like that has been one of those the most authentic relationships ever. And I realized that like with my dad, it was like the one relationship I wasn't being authentic with. That was like, very big pillar of like my family and like also one of my core beliefs. Because like my first one is my faith, my belief in God, and the second one is my family. And I'm like, and I can't even be authentic with one of the major corners of it. So it was
Yeah.
like, shoot, what am I doing?
Yeah.
And now, like, I can have those conversations with my dad, where obviously, like, I don't tell him everything that happened because that no one needs to know that. But
Right.
like, he's aware, and we have that conversation that yes, I am someone who is a survivor of domestic violence, and there are moments where I'm gonna act and react in ways that I cannot control because I'm still working on it. But
Mm-hmm.
before, like, I hid all that, and he thought that I was fine. And
Mm-hmm.
so now he knows. He's just like, okay, I gotta be a little more careful with her
Yeah.
because of sometimes how I act or how I say something might cause her to be activated. And I'm like, now we can have those conversations and interactions where I don't have to like hide and be ashamed, in
Right.
front of my dad. I'm like, that was like a big major thing that just happened very recently. Happened. you know, within the last month. So it's very like, you know, and then I realized as well, like I am kind of seeing someone. Like we're not actually dating, but we're, every now and then we'll go out and have dinner and talk and spend time together. And we went on a date on Saturday and like he wanted to go in for a hug and I was like, no, no, no hugs. And he was just like, okay. And he was just like, but I'm not him. And I'm like, no, you're not. But I'm still not ready. And if I'm not ready, I'm not putting myself anywhere that I'm not comfortable.
Right.
So it's baby steps or no steps at all.
Right.
And it was one of those where like I realized I'm like, I am able to now draw those boundary lines and
Right.
show what I am comfortable with and
Hmm.
what I feel secure in. And if you're not willing to stay within those boundaries while I'm working on myself and getting better and, getting, surpassing everything, then you have no place in my life.
Right.
And I was comfortable sharing with that. And I'm like, if he decides that he's not cool with that, then I'm sorry. Like, even if I like you, you have no place here. And he was like, okay, I got you. Baby steps. And that was it. That was the end of the conversation. And we were just like, and it didn't like affect it or make it awkward or weird and uncomfortable. It was just like, okay, if I want to be here with her, I have to do baby steps. And that's it. Stuff that
Right.
she's comfortable with. And it was that thing where he was willing to listen and like be aware of those boundaries. And he's like, as long, if she gives me the okay, then okay. If not, then, you know.
Yeah.
And I'd never been able to really do that before, be able to like place those boundaries and be firm and vocal about them. And this time I was just like straight up, like
Yeah.
baby steps are no steps,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And
And
when
like
your
it
belief, oh, sorry, go ahead.
was just like that living, authentically and like it drastically changed my viewpoint, you know?
Right. Yeah. No, that's so good. Yeah. And I think we don't realize that when we're in that like recovering people pleaser place, that we do say yes to a lot of things that our bodies say no to, right? Just because we're trying to
Mhm.
appease the masses, right? Like, oh, I don't typically like this person, but whatever, high five, I'll high five you, even though like my whole body's like abort, 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 right?
Right.
Um, but we do, and we override our subconscious programming. And then the more you override your subconscious programming, the less you start to trust yourself, right? And then everything now all of a sudden is swallowed up by doubt. I remember there was like a time where I started dating and I was like, I was just feeling swallowed up by doubt. Like, I'm like, I don't know how to exist in this in a healthy way. And like, what do I do here? And then when healthy relationships were presented to me, I was like, oh, this is weird and boring because it's not chaotic and like, and then I had to learn that a lot of that was me, right, spilling over.
Mhm.
And so that took me a long time even to get to the point where I was like, oh, like I can voice what I want. It's okay for me to, as a woman, to have needs. It's okay for me as a mother to put my kids before everything. And if I'm with a man that can't accept that my kids come first, then that's already like a red flag, right? So I
Yes.
love that you're like in that place now where it's like honor me for me and where I'm at, and we can go somewhere. And if you can't honor me where I'm at and what my needs are, then it's okay. Like I'm good here. I got me. We're good.
Mhm.
And
Exactly.
we're either going to fall into the fold together or we're not. And either way, I still got me. I'm still good, right? It's all of that. So, so powerful. All right. So, respective time, because we're already at an hour. I know you and I could talk forever just because we love each other so much. I'm just so fond of you. Your courage and everything you've been through. And, when you told your story at graduation, I like completely fell apart. And I was like, oh, right? It was just such a special
The
moment to
2 week
share with
streak,
you.
girl.
I know. I know. Just, yeah. Okay. So with that, what do you wish people understood about like being a domestic violence survivor? What is something that you just feel like people understood at a deeper level?
I think the biggest thing that I wish people understood is that it is very hard to get out of that victim mentality ourselves. So that when other people see us as victims as opposed to survivors and they treat us in that sphere of victimhood, it's even harder for us to get out of that. And
Yeah.
so I remember that my mother has not once treated me as a victim, except maybe like the day she found out. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that day she found out, she was just like, oh shoot, someone messed with my baby. No one's getting near my baby.
Mm-hmm.
But then after that, my mom's just like, okay, you got to pick yourself up. You got to find your reason. You got to, find your anchor and move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't like she was disregarding. There's a difference between, you know, treating me and, pitying me
Mm-hmm.
and like completely ignoring and devaluing what I went through. And she did not do either of those. She made sure that she was like, okay, you survived. Just get stronger. Like, use this as an impulse to get stronger and never go and be in that situation again. Learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I realized was my friends and like other people like who would find out would often treat me, as a victim, like, oh, poor her. What did she like what she went through and what her kids like I can't even imagine what her kids went through kind of thing. And it became very tiresome to be able to like honestly be true to myself as a survivor when everybody else kept like imposing those ideas of like victimhood. I was like, but I don't want to be a victim any longer.
Right.
Like I want to be known as something else. Like I don't want this to be my identity. And
Yeah.
so something I wish, people who have never gone through it, even people who have gone through it and are going through it, is precisely that. That like you are a victim, yes, but most importantly, when you are become a survivor, you need to take yourself out of that victim mindset
Mm-hmm.
because then you won't grow. You'll stagnate and you'll just take the pity, take everything from everybody else, and you'll feel so helpless. And it won't help because then you will feel like, well, I need the help of everybody else in order to do something, to get out. And that's the big thing is like we need to realize, and other people need to realize that it's okay to be a victim. I'm not saying it's not, but there comes a point when you need to switch that mindset and make it a survivor mindset and
Mm-hmm.
use your past and use your, time as a victim to grow stronger and so that your identity is no longer in a victim of whatever circumstance, but
Yeah.
now your identity is as someone who has survived and has overcome.
Right. I love that point too because I talk about this a lot of just having the understanding that when being a victim means that I can blame the external, right? So, like when I'm a
Mhm,
victim of a circumstance, then my experience is heavily rooted in that external experience, right? And
right.
so I talk about that a lot of like when you flip that script and you start to have acceptance for what was, then you can be empowered to create change. Because until you're willing to be in acceptance of what is, it's really hard to grow. You can't grow from blame. I can't
Mhm,
sit here and grow from blaming all the circumstances in my life that created shitstorms, right? Like all I
mhm,
can do is go, wow, that shitstorm really sucked. And I don't ever want to repeat that again. So let me accept it
yes.
and then move forward, right? But that's one of the biggest things too, is people used to be like, well, aren't you mad? And I'm like, of course I'm mad. Like my family's imploded. I'm now a single mom of 4 children, which is not what I signed up for when I got married, right? And so then it's like, of
Mhm,
course I'm mad. How could I not be mad? But the reality is at some point I have to accept the role I played in my own suffering. And once I have acceptance for that and I cannot root in, putting everything in his court, guess what? Now I'm empowered. Now I know how to choose
mhm,
differently. Now I know how to live differently. Now I know how to exist differently. And now that's fuel for my purpose. That's fuel for me making sure my kids will never have to worry. That's fuel for me becoming a better version of the mom that I was, right? And so, yeah, I love that you bring up that point because it's true. Once you get into like, oh, I survived that and it just catapulted me forward and now 150 times better than I ever was, that's a survivor story. And that's a mess with me story, right? because
Yeah.
because when we've been through what we've been through, and then now we're on the other side of it and we're like, oh, I see you. Don't you think I don't see you? But that's
Mhm.
okay. You don't have to see you. Right? And now I know what
Yeah.
is and what was, and I'll be better because of it. Yeah, such an empowering stance. So, on the last question, what's something you would share with someone who might be going through a similar experience? I mean, what you just shared about, surviving is huge, but is there any other piece of advice you would give to someone who might be in a similar experience?
Yeah, I would say for sure to not diminish your own experiences because every
Mm,
experience is going to be different. I was only fortunately for me, I was only in my situation, for about a year and a half. And even that year and a half had detrimental effects, not just on myself, but on my children. Like, honestly, it doesn't really matter how long of a time period, be it a
mm,
short period or a very long period, that you're in that situation. It will damage you.
mhm.
And every person is different. So if you're a very emotional person, even a short amount of period will affect you and hit you like a ton of bricks. As someone who isn't as, rooted in their emotions, is in that relationship for much longer, maybe you have the same kind of activations to the same degree, even though the experience was shorter and different. So I would definitely say that one of the biggest things for me was like I was ashamed of what I went through because I thought that I was smarter than that. But then I was also very, rooted in the fact that like mine isn't as, you know, graphic or um as long as some other, women who have gone through this. And so I was very timid and very like reluctant to, take root in that and admit and be, and take pride in what I'd overcome because I would say, oh, but mine wasn't as bad as, so and so's, or mine, was only, this amount of time.
Yeah,
And then I realized is that I'm like, don't diminish what you went through. And
right.
it won't look the same for everybody else. It won't be the same, but it is your story, it's your experience, so own it. Own, however long, however bad it was. And even if it wasn't that bad, own it. If it wasn't that long, own it. Don't diminish what you went through. And that's one of the, biggest things aside from, the victim mentality, getting outside of that is precisely that. Don't diminish your experience or what you went through and don't let anybody else diminish it.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with that because there was a lot of, I think, in that tolerating phase where I was like, oh, if you're just mean to me, I can
Hmm.
handle it, right? And I think I diminished a lot of what I was going through at that time because I was like, well, it's okay. Like, I'm grown. And my frontal cortex is
Yeah.
developed, right? I have an idea of what this is about. And really, this is your cry for help and it has nothing to do with me. And I did a lot of that like rationalizing, but I downplayed what my experience was. And I think the other piece of that too is I feel like when people haven't been rooted in a domestic violence experience, there is a level of like them going, well, just leave. Like, why don't you just leave?
Hmm.
Like, you could just leave at any point. And it's like the mental scrutiny that we are drugged through every single day and the level of, I mean, just looking at the statistics now of like cortisol that's in our body, and the reality is that we live in fight or flight 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Like, you're never out of it. You're literally surviving every minute of every day. And if you're not in surviving because there's current conflict, you're literally walking on eggshells to prepare for whatever could come next to make sure that you're not caught off guard, right? And
Oh yeah.
so people would tell me all the time, like, oh, well, you could just leave. And I was like, yeah, but then when you start to build strength, the first thing they do is exploit your weaknesses. And so then you're caught in like the, I'm gonna, like you said, I'm gonna take your kids away, I'm gonna, like, it's like this vindictive, or there was one point where there was a threat of suicide. And then I'm like, well, oh my God, like if I leave and then like that happens, then my kids are gonna hate me forever, because now he's gonna spend his whole life without his dad. And I was like, blah! Like it was a wild emotional ride that I could not just like get on a bike and get out of. And then I feel like we romanticize what our relationship was in the beginning. And so when the leaving happens, all of a sudden you're back playing like, what happened to us? It was so beautiful in the beginning, right? And then I was in this romanticizing phase of like, well, it could be everything it was, right? Like we could go back to that, we could get back there, and then, but it was all what I had made up in my mind of what it was, because none of that was really ever real, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I don't know, there's just like so many things. We could probably talk about this forever, but I feel like
Good.
going through the similar experience, like wherever you are, like if there is a woman out there who listens to this when we put it on YouTube or whatever, we see you, we understand you, we know it's not easy. But I guess my biggest takeaway is like, life on the other side is so much prettier than you could even imagine. There's freedom, there's love, there's capacity for healing, there's capacity for holding space for your kids, because truly when you're rooted in a domestic violence relationship, you're not holding space for your kids like you want to, because you're literally exhausted 24/7, 365. So just sending you so much love, and like, we are here, and just reach out and find an Athena program. I teach them like every other month. Like I will hold space forever, because even just you and your experience with Young Athena and 10 weeks and like the life changing path that you're on, and you're going to be so much greater than we could have ever imagined, just from a tiny little pebble that we dropped on you in week 2. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So well, for the sake of time, I'm going to wrap us up. And thank you so much for being a part of episode 3 of Rising Leaders podcast. I am so appreciative of you. I always will be. And just thanks for your vulnerability and your love, and just your willingness to sit here with me and have this really vulnerable conversation about a topic that should be more normalized. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.